Hey guys, this next lesson is about reproductive strategies. We're going to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of sexual versus asexual reproduction, but most of this lesson is just going to be a whole bunch of different asexual reproduction strategies. Okay, so the reproductive strategies that we're going to be looking at, again, are going to be mostly different types of asexual strategies. And then towards the end of this lesson, we're also going to look at processes called alternation of generations and look at the difference between gametophytes and sporophytes, which only exist in plants. We're also going to look at the process called the alternation of sexual cycles. And out of this entire lesson, the alternation of generations and alternation of sexual cycles are probably the most important part. So sexual reproduction is obviously just when species reproduce through the fertilization of gametes. So like a sperm and an egg coming together, the gametes, as we've already learned, are produced via meiosis. Some of the downsides of sexual reproduction is that it is very energetically costly compared to asexual reproduction. So it requires a lot of energy, usually on the maternal side of things. It's also very slow and time-consuming compared to asexual reproduction because of the gestation or the pregnancy period. And then it also requires two individuals, and because of that, not every individual in a species will be able to find a mate and produce children. Whereas with asexual reproduction, you can do it on your own, so every individual in the population can reproduce and have children. But the big benefit of sexual reproduction is the genetic variation. You get way more genetic variation out of sexual reproduction than asexual reproduction, and the more genetic variation there is, the less likely that species is to go extinct because it's more adaptable. Another benefit is less competition between siblings. Because siblings are unique, they're not usually competing for the exact same things all the time. If we think of like humans, for instance, like me and my sister might have very different taste in food, so we wouldn't compete for the same food in the wild. Or we might have a very different taste in men and therefore not be competing for the same mates in the wild, stuff like that. Whereas with asexually reproduced siblings, they're identical to each other, so they're definitely going to be competing for all the same things. Damaged chromosomes and harmful mutations also leave populations more easily when there is sexual reproduction, again, because not every individual is identical to each other. So in an asexually reproducing population, if a harmful mutation shows up, all of the offspring are going to have that harmful mutation. In a sexually reproducing population, a harmful mutation might show up in a parent, but then because the offspring aren't identical to the parent, that harmful mutation can go away again. So asexual reproduction is when the offspring are produced using mitosis instead. The offspring is produced by a single individual, so there's no mixing of genetics. There will be no crossing over, no independent assortment. And so because of that, the offspring will be identical to both each other and the parent. It is less energetically costly, less time consuming, and everyone in the population can do it. But again, it does make those organisms more vulnerable to extinction because they're less adaptable due to the decreased amount of genetic variation. The only source of genetic variation for asexually reproducing species is mutations caused by mistakes during DNA replication and mutagens and stuff like that. So we're going to go through all these different types of asexual reproduction one at a time. So we'll start with binary fission, which is used in prokaryotes, which are organisms that don't have a nuclei, like bacteria. This is when the parent cell will replicate its DNA so that it has two copies of the DNA, move those two copies to opposite sides of the cell, and then the cell divides. So it's essentially like mitosis, only it doesn't involve centrioles or spindle fibers. It can happen very, very quickly, which is why bacteria can grow like exponentially. And since they are all identical, it does mean that you can also kill bacteria fairly easily with like a Lysol wipe on the counter or something. If a chemical is going to kill one of them, it's going to kill all of them or 99.99% of them. So this is how this would look. At the top here, we have the parent cell. It's going to replicate its DNA and then put one version of the DNA on kind of either side and then split the cell. The two resulting daughter cells are identical to each other and identical to what the original parent was. You'll also notice that during this process, the parent like disappears because the parent itself is what is dividing into the two new daughter cells. Conjugation also happens in prokaryotes. This is when genetic material is transferred from one prokaryote to another through a conjugation tube, also called a pilus. Essentially, the donor cell will transfer its genetic material to the recipient cell, which will make the two cells identical to each other. So that's kind of what this is showing at the bottom here. This is the little conjugation tube through which the genetic material will travel. Budding can happen in more complex organisms like Hydra and yeast. Essentially, this is when you have the parent, and then the parent will grow a new little bud of cells through mitosis. And then the bud obviously will have the same DNA as the parent because it is produced via mitosis, and then the bud just like falls off and becomes its own organism. So in the top here, we have a picture of a hydra. So the parent is the big tall one. It's growing the bud on the side, and then that bud would fall off and become its own hydra. And it's also kind of shown cartoony at the bottom here. Then we have fragmentation, which can happen again in more complex organisms. This is when a piece of the parent organism falls off or is cut off or something, and then the parent will regrow the missing part, and the part that fell off will regrow the rest of its body. So this happens in starfish, for instance. So in this example down here, we have a starfish. One of the arms gets cut off. The body, which is missing an arm, will regrow the arm, but the arm will also regrow a body. And in this picture here, this is a real life one. So this is an arm that got chopped off or cut off of a starfish, and it is in the process of regrowing a body, which is why the rest of the body is so tiny. Then there is vegetative propagation, which, as the name suggests, happens in vegetation, like plants. This is when a new plant will develop at the end of the stem, root, or leaf of the parent plant. A really common type of this is when the parent plant has like roots that go underground, and then from those roots, new offspring will kind of sprout up. The new plant will again be identical to the parent plant. Lots of different plants do this. One of the big downsides is that the offspring of the plant is going to be competing with the parent and with other offspring for access to sunlight and nutrients and water and all that kind of stuff because they're attached. Then a super cool type of asexual reproduction is parthenogenesis. This is when a female's egg develops into a new organism without being fertilized. So the egg is the only source of genetic information for the embryo, so the offspring will be genetically identical to the mother. Scientists are actually trying to kind of use this idea in humans to create blastocysts that can be used for stem cells in the hope that it would be less controversial than like normal fertilized produced blastocysts. But yeah, parthenogenesis is really cool. It's something that happens in sexually reproducing species, every now and then some sexually reproducing species can switch to asexual reproduction only for the females. And yeah, some sharks can do this. And then there is sporogenesis, which refers to the use of spores. All of the brown stuff on the bottom of these plant leaves up here are a whole bunch of little tiny spores. They actually kind of gross me out. But the spores will contain genetic information as well as cytoplasm and are surrounded by a protective layer. And there's a whole bunch of different methods that can be used to disperse the spores. Some of them just kind of blow away. Some of them will stick to the fur of animals. Some of them actually kind of get like shot off with like pressure. And then wherever those spores land, they'll just kind of wait there inside of their little protective cocoon until conditions are favorable, and then the spore will open and the organism will begin to form from there. The benefit of sporogenesis over, say, vegetative propagation is that those spores get spread further away from the parent and from each other, and therefore there's less competition between related individuals. Spores can be either haploid or diploid and can be formed by either meiosis or mitosis. If the spore is created from meiosis, then the offspring won't be identical to the parent. If it's created by mitosis, then it will be identical. Okay, so this is one of the important things that we're going to be talking about in this lesson, alternation of generations. It's essentially this idea that within kind of one organism, over multiple generations, it'll go back and forth between being diploid and haploid. This happens in some plants and fungus. Essentially, the adult diploid will be called a sporophyte, and the adult haploid is called a gametophyte. The gametophyte will produce haploid gametes from mitosis, and then the two haploid gametes will fuse together, which is fertilization. They'll produce a zygote. The zygote will grow using mitosis to become the diploid sporophyte, and then the sporophyte will produce spores via meiosis, which are haploid. And then the spores will grow using mitosis to produce the gametophytes, and the cycle just keeps going over and over and over again. The one kind of confusing part about this is the fact that in alternation of generations, gametes are produced via mitosis instead of meiosis. And the reason for that is because the cells that are producing the gametes are already haploid. So they don't have to do the two divisions of meiosis in order to get a haploid gamete. They can just do the one division of mitosis instead. So yeah, a lot of plants will include both gametophytes and sporophytes. Usually one is dominant over the other. The non-dominant generation will be smaller and more temporary. And then the dominant one will be kind of more long-term and larger. So if you think of like moss, the gametophytes are more dominant. That's like the big leafy green mat of moss that you would see. Yeah, and then every now and then you'll see little stalks sticking up out of it. That is the less dominant structure. With vascular plants like trees and stuff like that, usually the sporophyte is the dominant one. That's the actual tree itself. And the gametophytes usually exist within like cones, for instance. So yeah. In that case, the pollen will fertilize the gametes, the female gametes inside the cone. As far as that goes, this is kind of what it looks like. This is the flow chart here. So again, you have your sporophyte, which is going to be diploid. It's going to undergo meiosis to produce the spores, which are haploid. And then the spores grow using mitosis into the gametophyte. And then the gametophyte will produce gametes through mitosis. The gametes will fertilize one another and produce a zygote, which grows using mitosis to make the sporophyte again. Okay? And this is the same kind of idea up here, just with the actual example of some sort of coniferous tree. Okay, so it's not super important to know which species are dominant and which ones aren't for non-vascular and vascular plants. I don't care too much about that. Know the general process of the alternation of generations. Be familiar with this flow chart here that describes the alternation of generations. That's going to be an important part of this. And then alternation of sexual cycles happens in animals. This is when the life cycle of that animal switches back and forth between sexually reproducing and asexually reproducing. So this happens in marine species like jellyfish. There will be two distinct adult forms. One will be like a non-motile or non-moving polyp, and the other will be the free-swimming medusa. So the asexual part happens when the organism is a polyp. The sexual reproduction part happens when it's in the medusa, the free-swimming phase. So this is what that would look like. So you've got the medusa here, that's the free-swimming one. It's going to produce the sperm and egg, since it is the sexually reproducing one. And then that is going to develop into the polyp. The polyp is then asexually reproducing, so it's just going to grow, it's going to create these buds, and then the buds fall off and develop into the medusa. That's it. I think I'm actually going to maybe draw out some, maybe a bit clearer flow charts of some of the processes that are happening here, and then that'll be it. Okay, so this is the alternation of generations. So we start with our, let's actually start with the sporophyte here. So the sporophyte is our diploid kind of parent. It then produces spores through meiosis. So it's essentially the same way that humans produce gametes. It produces spores through meiosis. And anytime we use meiosis, we cut the number of chromosomes in half. So we go from a diploid sporophyte to haploid spores. Each one of those spores is then going to divide and grow through mitosis to produce a gametophyte, which is also haploid because it just developed from a single spore, which was haploid. The gametophyte is then going to produce gametes. Now, what is weird about these gametes is that they are produced, and I'm sorry, that's wrong, through mitosis. Because the gametophyte is already haploid, we don't need to do two different divisions to make haploid gametes. One division is fine, which is why mitosis is used to produce our two haploid gametes. Those gametes then fertilize one another to form a diploid zygote. Because we had two different ends come together, we now have 2N. That zygote will then grow through the process of mitosis until we get back to the diploid sporophyte. Okay, so that is the alternation of generations. And then for the alternation of sexual cycles, we start with the medusa, which is sexually reproducing. Because it is sexually reproducing, it produces sperm and eggs. The sperm and eggs will fertilize each other to create an immature polyp. That polyp then grows to the adult polyp, which is asexually reproducing. So through the process of budding, we will end up with a polyp with a bud. The bud then falls off and produces the medusa. So this part of the flow chart is kind of the sexually reproducing part. This part over here is the asexually reproducing part. Okay, that's all.